Auckland, New Zealand, in an aquarium here, and I'm teaching a team of I don't know, about 10 staff here how to work with different shark species and penguins as well. So I do about 3 to 4 days a month with exotic animals in the water, and the rest of the year I'm training either detection dogs, primarily in biosecurity, and detection dog handlers and trainers as well.
Awesome, thank you. Bill Gaskins.
Hey everybody, Bill Gaskins here from Integrity Noseworks out of New Jersey. I was a military working dog handler from 1992 to 2013 when I retired. I had a cool opportunity to be a canine instructor from 2009 until I retired in 2013. Trained about 624 military working dogs for deployment, and handled 10 working dogs throughout my career. Was a kennel master, trainer, several different positions in the Air Force. When I retired, I got into sports scent work. Back in 2013, when it was first mentioned to me, I made fun of it. And now in 2017, I set up a business where it's what I teach exclusively. And so pretty deep into it now on the sports side. I've trained everything from an Italian Greyhound all the way through a Mastiff and everything in between for scent detection. So it's been a really cool experience, and super humble to be on a panel like this.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Bill. Ryan?
Well, my name's Ryan Millbern. Much like Bill just said, it's an absolute honor to be amongst the other people here on this panel today. So thank you for having me. My background, I've been doing detection work for about 20 years now. I'm a retired police officer, running interdiction dog. Started my canine career doing narcotics detection and tracking and trailing. Then had the great pleasure of going to Iraq for 3 years as a private contractor. Attached to the Baghdad Embassy Security Force. That's where I really got my feet wet on the explosive side. So was out there as a trainer and a handler. Came back, was talked into law enforcement again for another 5 years. After that, I left police work to go teach a police canine handler school out in North Carolina. And about 2 years of doing that, the Wynn Casino in Las Vegas called, and they needed a person to take over their bomb detection unit out here in Las Vegas. So I've been doing that for about 4 years now. And out here, we started the Casino and Resort Working Dog Association, which is a nonprofit 501c3 to help all of the private sector, because law enforcement dogs have enough issues, but at least there's some alphabet soup out there to help them. On the private side, there really isn't much out there. So that's what my nonprofit group does scholarships and helps tons of private security folks.
Cool. Thanks, Ryan. Frank?
Hello. Well, likewise with everyone else, I'm honored to be here. My name's Frank Schembre, and after 31 years retired with the federal government from the starting out in law enforcement with the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department and working my way through Homeland Security after 9/11 with the Federal Air Marshal Service. I ended up as a trainer instructor at where I'm located now in San Antonio, Texas at Lackland Air Force Base. Now I run, I have my two companies, Spectrum Canine Solutions, which we were involved with not only training and doing some seminars around the country. We also are a third-party certification organization for TSA's program. And I also am with the Olfactics Canine Technologies. I'm doing some research and some trials with the filter detection. So that basically is it, and I'm glad to be here. Talk to everyone.
Thanks, Frank.
Yep.
Paul Curtis.
Hey, hi, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's good to join you guys. Paul Curtis, retired law enforcement. Spent 22 years in law enforcement, most of it K9. Handler, trainer, program manager. Like most of the old people, retired and started a canine company. So nothing new there, but I own Sniff Industries, which we have two sides of the house. We do training and consulting with some product sales. I patented a device for detection training and in 2014, and when I retired, I started making that available. So kind of running with that. I just dove into a hotel room here in Milwaukee so I could do this, and I didn't have any of my equipment with me. So I'm going to hang on and probably learn more than I'll give here. So thanks for having me.
I appreciate it. So the next one we've got is Stuart. Oh, before I go on, if there's anybody who doesn't want to go through introducing themselves just because they're here to learn, just pop your name in the chat and say, want to, have a crack at this. So, yeah, because I don't want to put anybody on the spot. But we've got Stuart Eckert next.
Yeah, how you going? How you going? Yeah, Stuart, currently deployed detection handler in the Queensland Police Service in Australia. Got my partner here as well, Justin Parker. So we've been working district dogs for about 4 to 5 years now. So we're just here to learn and gather some knowledge.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Is Cam still working there as a sergeant?
Yeah, he's still sort of on his way out now, sort of getting to that age. So.
Cool. No worries. All right. Let's see who's next. Not me. Andrew Much. Wants to be quiet. Okay. Nathan, Dr. Hall, I should say.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nathan. I'm an associate professor at Texas Tech University, and I've been doing detection dog research for about 12 years now.
Yes, and you've written some fantastic papers, I do have to say. All right, cool. I think that's about it. We've got lots of people in here, and lots of people are happy to listen. So cool. We've got some people who've written in.
Johnny, I believe you got Paul Bunker online.
Where is he? I can't see him on the screen. I saw him before. Where's Paul? Because I've got his book and I was going to ask him something about it. Paul, I can't see you on my list, but can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Oh,
okay?
there you are.
All right. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. My name's Paul Bunker, principal of Shire Canine, which is based in San Antonio, Texas. I did 22 years in the British Army as a canine trainer, instructor, assessor. Then when I retired, came over to the US, was working for the DOD at Lackland for about 7 years. Then did 7, 8 years in a commercial canine company up in North Carolina. Started off as the project manager for handler training for the Marine Corps. Went on to program manager for research and development for the Office of Naval Research and Detection, and then became the director of the school. And in 2017, I decided to start my own business, Shire Canine. Focus on detection only, and predominantly I do environmental and conservation work, about 40%, 50% of that. 40% is research and development, supporting different projects. And then around 10% is supporting state and federal agencies in advanced detection training.
You there, Johnny?
Yep, I am. I'm getting messages from Wayne. But that's all right. We'll go on. Because I've got what I need. We've done what we've needed. So we've got a bunch of questions here. The first one is obviously going to be the one about false alerts, which is always asked at every single detection course I've ever done. So this person writes, please share your thoughts on the concept that when a dog provides a false alert during a search for whatever reason and assumes a final trained response behavior such as sit, that this becomes reinforcing for the dog in that the anticipation of the reward releases high levels of dopamine regardless of the production of a reward. The theory being that once a dog false alerts, the potential for future, perhaps more frequent false alerts grows. That's quite a long question. So this is basically self-rewarding of the false alert, the dog's releasing dopamine when it false alerts. How do we solve that problem? Anybody want to have a go
I'll
first?
have a go at it, Johnny, and then I'll let everybody smash me up.
Cool.
So with probably everybody on this panel has more knowledge regarding neurotransmitters and everything than I do, but this is my take on it regarding the dopamine. The way I see this is there's a soup of dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin. All these chemicals are basically firing off in the brain, and it's true, I guess, that the research has shown that there are high levels of dopamine in the search, in the hunt, but I don't even understand the complexity of this and I don't think us as practitioners should break one component of this suit down and focus on it. As a practitioner and trainer, I know I can't control the dopamine, the serotonin, all these signs, all these things that are going on. But what I can control is the stimulus. I can control the reward. I can control, I can modify the behaviors and the responses. So what I refer to when I hear people talking about, hey, the dog is self-rewarding, that's probably true. He is self-rewarding. But as a practitioner, it's my job to step in as a trainer and modify that behavior. So those are I kind of see this. What comes to my mind is, not trying to be, I guess I'm trying to be funny. PMS. I can't control the outcome of PMS, but I know it's bad juju. So I know how to, with doing the dishes, bringing the flowers, I can control this. I can control the behaviors and the outcome. So I kind of associate that with, okay, whatever's making this dog do it, the simplest, the simplest answer to me is usually the right answer, and that's, hey, reward behavior. You're gonna, if you reward behavior, if you get a behavior, you reward it, you're gonna get more of that behavior. If you get the behavior, it's unwanted behavior, then I'm going to do something to extinguish and remove that behavior. So those are my 2 cents when I hear somebody talking about the complexities of these neurotransmitters and everything. And I'll pass it on to somebody else that wants to jump in.
I'll jump in for just a second. And this is Ryan, by the way. And this is just from a practitioner's standpoint, so not a scientist. I think Nathan and some of the other great people on this panel can talk more to the science side of it. But from a practitioner side, I think the question, yes, I think there is some level of self-reward. But from a practitioner standpoint, like Frank said, there's certain things that we can control. So the hierarchy of reward, if you know that ahead of time, that will help with that. But then also, and at least talking from a marker trained dog and a toy driven dog standpoint, putting food drive to the side, if the dog is going along on a search and then he again falses for, at least based on the question, an unknown reason, of course there is going to be some anticipation, some dopamine kick, for lack of a better term. But I think on the practitioner side, again, it seems like that is more of a bell curve than a spike. And especially with a marker trained dog, now they're anticipating the mark. They've already come and given their final alert. Now they're excited, they're anticipating, waiting for the mark that they're correct, and then they're going to get that reward that they've already chosen is the highest on their hierarchy of rewards. So then when you give the mark and get the toy, that dopamine is now spiking and extended rather than just the anticipation that it's coming. And then, of course, if they're falsing and we're waiting them out, that initial self-reward, if you will, of the dopamine that is coming from the anticipation, well, now they're waiting, and now they're getting, now that's lowering and lowering with their confidence of that alert until they finally make that decision to leave. And then at least it's been our practice, we give a slight verbal, not the mark, but something like good boy, that's a nice and calm. So it's not, again, the top of that hierarchy of reward, but it's confirming to the dog that just made that decision, well, crap, I'm not getting paid, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. We reward, again, lightly verbally, hey, you made the right decision, now go find it. So, and again, that's obviously very not a scientific answer to that. But at least from a practitioner side, in my experience, that's kind of how we deal with those in a very basic way of that kind of self-reward. But I think Paul and Nathan, I would love to hear your guys' response.
I'm not sure which Paul, but I'm going to jump in here as Paul Bunker.
Yes, Paul Bunker.
Okay. So this is actually, to me, a super complex question, and I think it would take a whole webinar to discuss all the complexities in false responses. The question actually details the fact the dog receives a dopamine rush from giving a false response. And I think there's a number of potential issues here if the dog is doing that. First of all, I would want to assess, is that dog a conservative dog or a liberal dog? If it's given a false response and receiving a dopamine rush from that, I'm going to say I'm leaning towards this is a liberal dog, which is more predisposition to give false responses just to try and anticipate and or receive a reward. My other question would be, why is a potential target which doesn't exist because they've said it's a false response producing a dopamine rush when there's no result? There shouldn't be a result, and everyone else has said about extinction. If there's no reinforcement, why is that dog receiving the dopamine rush from a target that doesn't exist, other than a self-reward that it's built up to a point that it's actually just receiving this rush, obviously, of dopamine at any point during a search? And that's potentially a self-rewarding search dog could do that. I think for any of this, any false response type issues, it really starts at the imprint phase with plenty of blanks, plenty of double blinds, use of extinction, and ensuring that you go through all the basic protocols to teach that dog or to educate the dog that false responses are just non-productive and don't exist. And the other issue we have to look at is, why is the dog giving a false response? And in this case, we're saying it's because it wants to produce that dopamine rush. But, you know, it could be for a lot of reasons, one of them being that there is something within that environment that the dog believes is close enough to the target that if it provides a response, it's gonna receive a reinforcement. So we can never actually 100% know what the dog is responding on, whether that's residual contamination, or whether the dog has been paired with something that we don't know about, or whether the dog just detects something that's slightly like the target it's looking for, and it's a very liberal dog, and it's just chancing its arm and seeing what it gets. So that's kind of condensed a lot that I think goes into a false response issue, but I certainly think they can be resolved As an example, a recent project I did with Florida International University, we give over 700 presentations of odors to 3 dogs, and there was 1 false response in all that. And I don't believe that the dogs were anything special. I just think that the protocols, once established from imprinting all the way through that dog's training phase, can produce a dog that predominantly does not provide false responses, because why should it? It's non-productive.
I'll be glad to jump in from a practical aspect also. And I agree with that, with what Paul Bunker says. But the way I've approached it from a practitioner standpoint is mitigate it from the front end. And you're obviously, if you know it's a false response, you're in a training mode. So whether your handler or your team is running where the hides are known, or they're running blind, well, as a trainer, I'll forsake the blindness of that run to mitigate that behavior. And like you said, the cause of that behavior can be very broad. So we may, in this conversation, we don't know what's causing it, but we'll mitigate it on the front end. So we make that in a very timely and quick response. We make that disagreeable to whatever level is appropriate, and then move on to the reward for the proper behavior and make the wrong behavior disagreeable. And that's a very simple answer, but that's how we address it.
Bill, you've got a few questions and a bit of input.
Again, from a practitioner's perspective and a guy who just reads a lot of books and listens to pretty much all of your podcasts, the way I see it is yeah, like some of the other folks have alluded to, is if you do good extinction training during the training sessions, and you start to understand that, hey man, although that's interesting, that shouldn't be reinforcing to you. The anticipation of reinforcement it may rise to a level where the dog gets excited and shows some anticipation, maybe waving their body, and you see those pre-indication behaviors. If the reinforcement history is clean, then you should have less false or unproductive indications. And so if the dog is doing that, then you have to kind of, like Paul and a couple of other folks alluded to, what is it in the environment, the totality of the circumstance that says to the dog, this area or this odor could potentially be reinforcing, so let me offer that indication. And so if through training, you do things like maybe back pressure to proof an indication, just a little bit like you would with bite work, and little things that test and proof the dog fighting back into the indication, oftentimes you can discourage it because they're not getting true reinforcement. Some of the other folks talked about bridge markers. You can do a good work guy, like a good, and then that way, if they hear that, they'll look around and go, well, if it's really a durable odor or a thing that is rising to the level that they're going to receive actual reinforcement for it, then they'll look at you like you're crazy and fight to go back to source. So it's all the things that we used to do, because in the early 90s, we would throw like keys or a choke chain or something like that to break the false indication behavior, to see if the dog, if we break their thought. Well, now we have all these other tools in our toolbox to use. And so that's what I was getting at, is that if you are very deliberate during the imprinting process, you should have less opportunity for the dog to generalize either to a thing or to an odor that is adjacent to something that they would normally indicate on. So these false or unproductive indications, I like false indications, because now I want to break it apart and really see, was it me not having good odor hygiene? Was it something that's an adjacent odor? Was it a distracting odor, such as, I put a cow hoof or a ball in a search area? Those things rise to the level of being a hard distraction for a dog to overcome. So sometimes they'll offer an indication because, hey, that also is what reinforces me, because we do some type of pairing with a Kong or a ball like we used to at Lackland. And so it's little things like that I want to understand what got them there. Did I put out the same box? Did I put out those things? So I think false or unproductive indications, like a couple other guys alluded to, there's way more to it. Like, generally, are we doing box training? Are we doing, furniture? Are we doing, a Hertzik wall? What's the training tools? What are the things that are there? And did I not do something right? That's the way I look at it. But I think it's pretty easy if the dog is clear of what's really actually reinforcing.
Well, Dr. Hall, did you have anything you wanted to add? I'd be curious to know your opinion about the actual, we discuss dopamine and all these things that the dogs have happening in their brain, but none of us are actual physiologists. We get that information from you guys. What's your take on this? What's happening in there?
Yeah, so I think everyone's covered the practical side quite nicely, but from the dopamine explanation, self-rewarding, I have to say it's what we would call like a circular explanation, meaning that it's not really an explanation. So how do you know that there's dopamine going on in the dog's brain and it's self-rewarding? Is because they false alerted. Why did they false alert? Because there's dopamine sort of surging in the brain. How do you know that there's dopamine surging in the brain? Because they false alerted. So you don't actually have independent evidence that there is this surge of dopamine going on. And in fact, when it comes to when do we know that specific situations would lead to an increase of dopamine in the brain and that they're self-rewarding, when it comes to actually assessing dopamine in dogs, there's really only a handful of studies, and it's done under very special imaging situations because it's very difficult to do without it being a terminal kind of procedure. So most of what we know is from rodents because it's a terminal procedure to actually crack open the brain and see if dopamine is being released or not. So in other words, when it comes to the situation of when a dog is false alerting, they're getting this dopamine and self-rewarding. From the scientific perspective, that is an entirely made up explanation. There's no independent evidence to say that dopamine is going on other than just looking at the dog and seeing that it's false alerting and it looks happy. So for the most part, that's all that we can really say from a scientific perspective in that specific situation. So when it comes to the practical components, I'd sort of lean back to what the others were saying, but I would actually argue that really we don't have any evidence to say that if the dog is false alerting, that there's a dopamine surge that is self-rewarding at all, unless you were to see that. I mean, for me, self-rewarding would mean that it would never go away, right? That a false alert would just continue on indefinitely forever, and that they would never stop false alerting because they are self-rewarding. And I don't think that's true, right? We see extinction of false alerts all the time. If you put it under extinction, then that means that it wasn't self-rewarding to begin with. It was being rewarded by something, but perhaps the dog was confused on what the contingencies were. There was any of the variety of reasons that were out there. But yeah, I would shy away personally from a dopamine explanation on there because we don't have the evidence for that.
Awesome. Oh, thank you so much for that explanation. Wayne, you wanted to ask something?
We've had a few questions come through, and I'm just going to start with one just straight to Paul, because I think Paul will like this one. But a person's emailed through saying, currently training my first explosive detection dog. What's the panel's thoughts on reward at source or reward away from source? And because I like Paul's detection boxes, I thought I'd throw it directly at him.
Sure. Yeah. Well, regardless of the detection, I like the dog to, I think we get more value, or I personally believe there's more value than leaving the dog in the instinct. So I do like rewarding at source because I want the dog to pinpoint the greatest source possible within the parameters of the environment. And there's no conflict there. You're using the engagement or the consumption to drive the hunt. So to keep those coupled together, that engagement or that consumption is there at the odor, which in my opinion gives us the greatest association. So even for an explosive dog, that's the way I imprint them. That's the way I train them. Hugely successful. And, you get a lot of people say, "Well, what do you do when they find that real device?" But that's an obedience issue. That's Fluffy, come to me. So I think those are two separate issues. But I like to take that core motivation that the dog has to do the work to start with and keep those coupled together. Obviously, and I know there's people that do a different way, the indirect and the marker training, and do it very well. There's people on this panel that do it very well, and I respect that and see how that's done, and I think it is a way to do it. But I prefer to keep those pieces of the instinct coupled together.
Next, I'm going to throw it to Bill because I can see him smiling and nodding his head away at 100 mile an hour. So.
Well, I mean, as somebody that came up with the direct reward style that, protocol training as it was referred to at Lackland in the early 90s, I came up the same way that Paul was explaining, that it was, we were tossing Kongs at boxes or tossing it over the dog's head, and ATF training that we did, in the run up for Afghanistan and Iraq, you're basically using the ears as the left and right boundary to toss the Kong through so that you could toss it right over the can so you don't knock the can over with the ATF. So I came up that way, trained hundreds of dogs that way. I'm a convert to markers. So I'm one of those folks that I'm an indirect reward was something we were teaching in 2012, 2013, because we lost a couple of handlers in Afghanistan. And so what we were trying to do was find a way to do protocols like Paul was explaining, dog indicates on explosives. We would, if we're on a real search, sorry, Fluffy, you're getting rewarded back at me, pal. I'm not tossing the Kong out in front of you. It's not that kind of party. It's not training versus, creating a protocol for the dog that the dog now returns back to the handler. That was something that was interesting to us. And so when I took my pause and then started training pet dogs, it works really cleanly with pet dogs to mark that way. So I've done both. I'm a certified nose work instructor with NACSW. And although I don't believe completely in their pairing process, we were pairing at Lackland by popping drawers and giving dogs Kongs back before it was cool. So it all works. I think the real key is differentiating to the dog in front of you. Some dogs work extremely well for a ball. Some dogs work very well with pairing and being reinforced at source. Some dogs work very well with indirect reinforcement. So I think it just kind of boils down to that, like Paul said, ain't no wrong way. It's the way that works for the dog. And so if the dog and the handler can do it, the 70-year-old woman that I have that's training her German Shepherd, she can't lean over to pair at the box because she has bad knees and a bad back. So indirect reinforcement works very cleanly for her to be able to let her dog come back to her and receive the treat from her hand. Would I do that with every handler? No say. There's some handlers that you can do direct reinforcement with. And so I've seen good and bad.
And Wayne, if I can jump in that for just a second, and
Away.
I'm going to be the guy right in the middle. I 100% agree with both Paul and Bill. From the practitioner side, though, and Bill hit it on the head, it's the dog in front of you. But of course, my specialty is explosives, and that's what I train all over the world with handlers. But there's also a big difference from your imprinting side of things as opposed to your operational. So on the imprintation side, I'm a firm believer in rewarding its source. Paul Curtis did not give me a bump here, but I love his boxes. They are phenomenal because it drops the reward right in front of the odor. Now, that's very different for teaching the dog and imprinting than now I'm teaching a handler and an operational dog, and we're going to Baghdad or Kabul or wherever. That's going to be very different. But then also, I've found great success with the vast majority of dogs where, at least in your maintenance training, you do both. And that variable reward concept for those dogs where they don't know, are they going to throw it between my ears using that as the rear sight, on your gun? That was the way I was taught back when I was a baby handler. They don't know if it's coming that way. They don't know if they're going to hear the mark from you and have to come back. And then even when you give that mark, What are you doing when the dog is coming back to you? Are you just dropping it by your feet? Are you winging it 100 yards? All of that to me adds into the success of the variable reward that is exciting and interesting for the dog to go find that target. So I think your situation is very different, but I 100% agree with both of them. There's not a wrong way. I will just add that the wrong way is to throw in an operational environment where you know that there may be maybe stuff, because I've seen it in my time in Iraq. We were watching another handler that had been taught the same way we were. And let me tell you, the first time you find that first bomb, that pucker factor, you go exactly to muscle memory, like you've done it 1,000 times before. And he's bouncing his Kong off the vehicle that his dog just alerted to in an operational environment. Thank God, grace of God, it didn't go boom and there wasn't a bad case, but I've seen that with my own eyes operationally. So with that, I'll turn it over.
And Ryan, you would have seen when we were in Malaysia, the indirect reward where they put it between their feet.
Yes. Yep. And that's okay to me, as long as the dog is moving away from the bomb and the handler in that terrible, utter panic pucker mode of, oh crap, this is really what I signed up for, and I just found one. They're not having to do something different than they've done 1,000 times before. So I'm totally good with it between their feet. I think they just miss out a little bit on that variable reward to really excite the dog, but not every dog needs that.
If I could just pop in with a question and maybe an explanation from where I'm coming from. I've only dabbled very, very lightly in explosive detection work a long, long time ago, but I've spent a lot of time with explosive dog handlers. And my background of training marine animals would mean that the way that we condition the marker should elicit the same response within the animal as the actual primary reward itself. And I mean, someone like Nathan may be able to speak to that, but from marine animal training, all we ever did was spend serious time in conditioning our markers and making sure they were super tight and the animal knew exactly what to expect. The communication line between the handler and the animal was really clean, which therefore meant whether you reward at source or whether you mark when the animal is at source, the learning and the physiological response from the dog through the classical conditioning process should theoretically be the same. I'm probably not the guy to have the papers to back that up, but that was kind of how I was raised with effective marker training, that it should elicit the same response.
I didn't even see you sneak in there, Ryan. I'm glad you're here. There's a question for you later, so don't run away.
Okay.
Frank, what's your thoughts?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, bud.
I think the main thing that when I'm explaining, so I came from, everybody knows where I came from, and that's probably like the marker is like, oh, that's taboo, that's they can't comprehend. I think if the listeners and everyone will understand simply that the mark is the reward, and that is you have marked that behavior, and it's identical. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. That is identical to the dog receiving the Kong, the toy. And once that clears through their mind, I think a lot of people will clarify and they'll understand they are actually rewarding at source, even with the marker. That's my 2 cents.
2 cents is 2 cents, Frank. You know what they say.
Those are some good sense.
Paul Bunker. I know we're all waiting for your response.
So I, very much agree with the majority of others, particularly Ryan. All my dogs are taught direct and indirect. And that starts from the infant process going through, as well as variable reward. And so I have an emergency recall, direct reward, indirect reward. So there's my 3 choices in the field. And my choice of what I'm going to utilize to communicate to that dog that it is correct depends on the type of dog I'm working, the scenario I'm in, the environment that we are in, whether it's safe to do a direct, reward or not. So that gives me tools in my toolbox, which allows me to reinforce the correct behavior based on what is presented in front of me. And that also goes to the variable reward. You know, if I'm working a dog on an oil spill response, for instance, and I had 83 fines in one day, I'm not going to use primary reward being a retrievable item 83 times. You know, that's impossible. So it gives me the option to decide that I'm going to use praise, or I'm going to use treats, or whatever it is, to extend the work duration of that dog. So the reward sequence, marking or providing a reward, the reward sequence, and then variable reward is very much dependent immediately on me being presented with a response from the dog in the field. But that is, as I said, trained in that dog from the very start of imprinting, moving through, that the dog understands that that is part of the game. The time to actually introduce this as a technique is not on your first deployment in Iraq when you find a bomb. You know, that dog has to understand the game way before that. So,
hey, Paul, can I ask, do you use individual markers for each one of those rewards, or are some just the physical presentation of the reward?
So I use clickers.
Yep. But do you use individual markers for each individual reward sequence if you're using it? No, okay, cool. Yeah, that was just out of curiosity.
You know, even on the direct reward, if a dog's given a response, it just knows it's going to receive a reward. Sometimes I walk up to the target and I have to place a pin flag, so I'll reward direct at source. Yep. Sometimes it's good enough that I'll just throw in from distance, and it comes back to me, and I can see sufficiently to tell the team behind me, hey, that's where you need to go and check. So even direct is variable depending on the environment and the scope of the task that's in front of me.
I like it, Paul. I like it. Dr. Hall, do you have a take on this at all?
Yeah, I mean, in our lab, a lot of times we'll use some type of marker just because it's easier in terms of the sort of scientific background. There's really not great research either way. For the most part, what it says is that it comes out to about the same. The marker never seems to win, but it does functionally come out to, in terms of training speed or maintenance, ends up working just about the same. So I think it comes down a lot of times to a practical issue rather than a one is going to be better per se in terms of giving you better behavior.
Oh, thank you. And sorry, Johnny Logan, I know I've muscled in and taken over off you. I've just got one more question that's come through on the side chat. So,
Wayne, excuse me.
Yeah.
I want to tie something before you proceed to the next question. I'd like to tie something in and get somebody else's input on this. It has to do with the no marker that I've heard a lot about, and my issue with it is like in extinction. Like let's tie this into the false response. It's my belief if I'm continuously giving the dog the answer with a no marker in a training scenario, in that once it comes time for operational use, once it comes time for certification, then I put the burden of decision making upon the dog. And 9 times out of 10, what I've seen is once that burden gets put on the dog in that type of scenario and you don't know the answer, then we got some serious issues. So I'd like to get someone else's input on the no marker.
This is Ryan. I can't say that I've ever used the no marker, but at least to me, it seems like it would be essentially the equivalent of pulling the dog off of a known false. So now the dog is just testing. And again, it depends on the dog in front of you, obviously. And like Mr. Bunker had already talked about, a liberal dog versus a conservative dog. But if you've got the dog that now thinks, well, I'm going to sit and see if I'm right, and then If I am, mom will give me the toy. And if I'm wrong, mom will say no, or mom will pull me away from it. To me, at least in my programs, I've seen those false rates increase when we're pulling dogs off. And I think giving the no marker, at least in my experience, I think would be roughly the same equivalent, where now we as the handler are making the decision. That's the dog's entire job, right? They're supposed to tell us where stuff is. And so that's why, at least in my programs, I've seen huge success in waiting them out until they make that decision on their own to leave, and not just looking back or not repositioning. Or sometimes you get that extinction burst where they don't know what behavior to give, so now they're aggressing or they're barking at it or whatever. But I will correct on any kind of aggression, but I don't correct on the false. I let the dog make that decision, and then I'll give just a light good boy after they've made the decision to move on. But at least in my programs, both in Iraq and here stateside, I've seen our false rates go down considerably by implementing that. And to me, I think saying the no marker, in my humble opinion, seems to be pretty similar to just pulling them away.
Yeah, Bill here, if I could second that emotion. Like I just think that I don't teach it to my scent work students. I didn't teach it to my working dog students either. And even before I was really deep into markers and reading about them and stuff, when we went to SeaWorld and saw how they used them on killer whales and dolphins, like the question I always had is, well, what if they're wrong? And they simply put, like, dude, it's an apex predator. We just wait him out. And then he makes the right choice because he's motivated to go get the fish and not the trainer. And so
Some of these Malinois are apex predators.
facts, especially the big red 90-pound ones. And so yeah, like I think that that's how I look at it. Is that look, even the Bichon can take that just as well as the Mal. If you just, the anticipation of reinforcement will become motivating because they're not getting reinforced. They'll get pissed. And they'll make the choice to look back at you and go, well, this isn't reinforcing. And then so they'll stop, and then they'll go make the right decision. And then you have a party for them, and they go, oh, that other decision didn't get me anything. I'm going to make this decision again. Give me one more again of those. And so I know folks that use the no marker. I'm a fan of it. I get the science of it. I get I get it. It's just, it's not clean for my scent work folks. And I never used it on active duty. And it's been 10 years since I was on active duty, so I can't speak to bomb stuff anymore.
And Bill, let me ask you, so once the dog has made that decision, do you give a light verbal reward, or do you just go with it until they find the correct odor and then pay them market like you normally would?
Yeah, in training, perfect environment, I control the variables, this, that, and the third. Right. Yeah, I honestly let this handler sit there until the dog makes the choice to leave. I do with dice double negative. I'll do moments where I have them pull the leash a little bit of back pressure, or I'll have the handler keep walking. Anything that they can do to get the dog to understand that although you think there's something there, bro, there ain't nothing there. And it's if there is, and then what the handler learns from that too is the dog's indication becomes durable. The dog will start to understand that when it's really there, I'm gonna fight you to stay there because, hey, you owe me. I found this. Where's my reinforcement at? Versus the dog that's not as convinced, like they're generalizing. You don't see the same precursors to the indication. The tail's not wagging, the ears aren't up, the sniffing behavior is not the same. All the things we all know, those things aren't present, but it's offering an indication, either a freeze, a sit, whatever everybody's teaching. And so if they don't see those things during the training process, it teaches the handler what the differences are from a generalization, unproductive indication is versus a productive indication. So the handler starts to learn it, the dog starts to learn it, and they do the Lackland shuffle, as some of you guys know. Like they'll do something where they move, and I have them do that when all throughout it, do the same things that they would do. Like everybody stops talking, all those things as trainers that we do wrong too. Like I'll have that happen throughout the search to proof all the different variables so that this won't happen as much. So that's why I don't need it. I'm here for it. I think it makes sense, and certain trainers kick butt doing it. It doesn't work for me, and partly because I very cleanly follow some of the stuff that all of you guys have said in some of these other podcasts and stuff.
So Bill, I want to piggyback on what you just said, because it is a is a very important and critical portion of that extinction process of what you just said. Regardless of, I believe, whatever method you're using to abolish and remove that unwanted behavior of a false response, it's so critical. Every method, we're telling the dog what not to do. It's so critical that we essentially tell the dog what to do. And that's why when I'm teaching extinction, yes, I will wait the dog out, and he will not receive any stimulus. That's the important part. But the most critical part is I want to take the dog back to that area and let him leave on his own. That's when once he does that on his own, that's when I'm going to reinforce, and that's where I'm going to deliver the jackpot and say, yes, that's my man. You did the right job. That's where the reward comes in. That's a component that I see. A lot of people say, well, extinction doesn't work. Well, when I watch them do it, I'm saying, well, extinction doesn't work because, you're going to get extinction bursts. You're going to get all these. You've never told the dog what to do. And so I wanted to say what you just said is, hey, praise that behavior when they do make that decision to leave. A lot of times, Ryan, you kind of mentioned, hey, would it be a soft praise, good boy? My method is I don't even say anything. He gets up and leaves because 9 times out of 10, if I really don't go with him, if I'm kind of going to slow walk him, he's going to go back and try it again. So I will just let him leave and then do a hook, do a horseshoe or whatever to get back to that problem area. When he sniffs it and makes that decision on his own, that's when I'm going to deliver. That's when I'm going to deliver the praise. That's when I'm going to show him, hey, we show you what not to do. Now I'm going to show you what you just did the right thing. So,
and that's with the full mark and the full toy and the full reward.
No, I'm not gonna deliver the jet because it's a false response. I'm just going to deliver secondary reward and praise the behavior.
Gotcha. I'm tracking.
And to put a bow on my side of it, to piggyback on Frank, as all of us military guys love somebody piggybacking. I think what I like about that too is in Paul Bunker's book, when he talks about reinforcement stuff, and it's the same stuff I learned at Lackland many moons ago. If you have a dog that's balanced and you've been keeping him in a low drive state with food and you want him to work this, that, and the third, but you have a ball available, like what you're talking about, I think what I would do is when the dog is right, when the dog makes the choice to leave, because we've given him no reinforcement at all, no marker, no other things, no anything else, and they go and make the right choice. If they're a balanced dog and they are just as high drive for the ball, that's when I'll present the ball and play with them. That's the explosion of the party that I would give. So when they go from they got nothing because they were making the wrong choice, and it's a unreinforcing choice, as soon as they make the choice to leave it and then they go to the hide and indicate on the hide, that's where the party happens. And that's where I would bring the ball and it would turn into a play-pray moment, and we just literally explode. And then the next time they go through, if they half-ass an indication, sorry for those out there, if they don't go do good work and they go and they do a false unproductive indication, they'll hopefully remember through recognition, prime decision making, last time I did this, man, I didn't have a party. But if I go make the right choice, I get the party. That's the way that I'm trying to wire their brain.
I'd like to jump in on that too, and agree on 1,000% on you got to do the here's what not to do and here's what to do. I think that's without question. The methodology, mine is a little different. When we get to the what not to do, I've only got so long to live, so I want to communicate to that dog. We're doing 15,000 communications with that dog in so many other ways. So in my opinion, I'm going to communicate to that dog, we're in a controlled environment, controlled situations, and the best we can to whatever stimulus or whatever we're creating. So if I know it's an unwanted behavior, I'm going to communicate to the dog, I don't want that. I don't want you to do that. And there's a consequence for that. And then go to the what to do. So I have the consequence on one end and I have the reward on the other. So the methodology is a little different. I totally agree with, you have to have both parts of that. It has to be a balance, I absolutely agree with that 100%. But, you have, dogs are like people. Drives, instincts are different levels. So are intelligence, and if I get that dog in there that's, missing some of that intelligence, and I really don't want to wait him out to make that decision because he may not be a great decision maker to start with, even though he has an enormous amount of drive. So that's my take on that.
Well, I'll ask the next question. I know Ryan and Frank have both had very in-depth conversations regarding this one. Nathan, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to add on the topic. I mean, I'd say from my perspective that in a lot of the cases that we've discussed, that there kind of is a no reward marker going on, but we're using time or duration of time as sort of the no reward marker, that the dog is sitting in a false for a specific period of time, and after it's been kind of long, that becomes the marker. And I think what my interpretation would be is that that's imposing cost by delaying to get to the reinforcer. And I think some of the things that you guys were talking about is if you try and deliver a quick no reward marker or pull the dog off immediately, the cost there might actually be less because the dog can then just move on to where the target is faster. So we'll use a marker that's discrete to facilitate some separation between a correct and incorrect response. But when our no reward marker goes off, that terminates the search. So if they make a false alert, there's an indicator that they have made an alert that was incorrect, but then they have to reset. So then we still impose that same cost period of time, and it's actually a little bit more. But that's the last step that we add onto our training. And I'd say 95% of the dogs that we work with, the no reward marker never goes off because just waiting them out is sufficient.
Interesting. So, Ryan and Frank, I've discussed this with you multiple times. It's going to be interesting to hear what other people say. So, food or toy reward, doesn't matter. See a lot of grins there. Anyone want to answer first?
Sorry, I thought you said that question was for Frank. I'm happy to answer this. I use both. I use either or either. And it depends on the dog. It's as simple as that. Whatever the dog finds reinforcing, I'll use. Now, I'm not restricted to the fact that I have to select dogs with high retrieve drive. I can select dogs with high reward drive. So I have trained dogs that will only take food. Nathan Dalton was one of them, as you know. Loved his cheese. Fantastic dog. Really nice work ethic. Big blockhead Labrador. Funny as hell. Loved training him, but it was just cheese, and that's fine. I'll absolutely train the dog only on cheese. Another dog we had, Bin, ball only. He will do nothing else. He'd respond on target. You could click if you want and try and give him food. Nothing. He would not take it. It's only ball. Now, the majority of dogs take both, as we've already spoken about, and I have no issue either way. But I have more flexibility in the use of dogs in comparison to those that are tied into state, federal, or some sort of agency work where policy takes over. I train the dogs as I want to train them and for whatever tasks that I go forward to. So it's whatever the dog finds rewarding.
Oh, I'm the same as you.
Bill, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I mean, first, as I put in the chat, I'm so fanboying right now. No, I'm the same. As somebody that grew up with you, they must be Kong or ball, and you're not allowed to swap for Kong or ball because it says it in the records that they can't switch from Kong or ball. And then realizing that the dog doesn't like Kongs or balls, and that they really are motivated by food, and finding a dog that you just, food depth them a little bit and then become more motivated for food. Like the dog gets a vote. I think we all tend to forget that. I get told by police guys here in Jersey all the time that, food reward is silly because the dog's going to go reinforce itself as it's walking around in the world and eat things off of the ground. And although I get where they're coming from, I do. I just think that if you choose the right type of food, the right type of reward used in the right way, and the dog you really take the time to know, the dog will let you know what's reinforcing. That's it.
I agree 100% with what was said, and obviously, we train some of the same dogs that Paul did, so we use the same thing. I think the only thing to add is that sometimes you can be clever with the reward that you select based off of the task that you're doing. So, sometimes you'll have a situation where you have a dog that has a very aggressive response because of a particular reward. You switch it to a different reinforcer and that immediately goes away. So sometimes you can be quite clever by just manipulating what you're using for the task to get the dog in the right sort of state for what you want.
So no more thoughts on that one? All right. Another question we've got come through. What are the group's thoughts on teaching a dog to search for its reinforcer as the foundation odor, and then training and introducing the target odors down the track?
I can speak to sport stuff, and then I'd be happy to defer to Tobias Gustafson and other people that are way gooder at it than me. I would say what I've seen with sport dogs is they refer to it as teaching on primary. So in the NACSW dogma, it's the dog is searching for treats in a box until it starts to really understand the search process, because they're making the assumption the dog doesn't know how to search and use its nose. And so they do a ton of work with treats in a box. And the negative transfer of learning later is that when they get to trial, now they have treats in a box as a distractor. So what you have is now a dog that's been trained in its history and it has a reinforcement history on just treats. And now it's in trial, it's having failure points and unproductive responses because it's now indicating on treats in a box, which 6 months ago it was being reinforced for doing. And so there's a little bit of clarity that happens that gets confusing for the dogs when you do that. There's tons of goodness when it comes to folks that I know that have done towels and Kongs and this, that, and the third. And I think you can, if you do it developmentally appropriately, Kongs aren't going to randomly pop up in most of your bomb searches. I get that. They're not just going to be everywhere. Although it was happening in Afghanistan where they were using Kongs as the initiator for explosives. That was a TTP. So that's a thing. But I would say that yeah, like if the dog has hunt issues, why not use something that's reinforcing for it to find at first, and then later on switch to primary? And again, I would defer to the scientists, practitioner dude that watches lots of videos that I think is really interesting.
So I just really read that question, and from what I get from it, the question's around the Kong is the reward, but they're going to cut that up and use that as the primary odor for imprinting.
Yeah, like Tobias does. Like if you guys haven't seen Tobias Gustafson's videos, they're redonkulous what he can do with dogs, and so it's pretty cool.
So the question I have is, if you know what that dog is going to be, narcotics, explosives, why not pair an original odor, an explosive odor or a narcotic odor straight off the bat and get straight into it? Why cut up a Kong? Like as a trainer who sells dogs, yes, I would do it because I don't know where the dog's going to go. So I just want to teach it the search pattern and etc. But if I know the dog's going to be an explosive dog, well, I'll start it straight on TATP or something like that.
Well, Wayne, I think you. Go ahead, Paul.
I do use Kong, and those that have read my workbook know I use Kong, and I do use Kong in the field. It is going to depend on the individual dog, but one of the advantages in using Kong as a neutral odor is that I can go and bury it, and I can leave it out wherever, and then I can train the dog to find aged buried target odor without worrying about explosives, narcotics, or whatever, caches of any type, any target. So I can model behaviors using a neutral odor, which I know is going to be there months and months later, and still a viable source. So that's one reason. Another reason is I can carry it on a plane with me. I can take it somewhere and do training in Lowe's, which is a huge do-it-yourself chain in America where dogs can actually go in and do detection training, if you like. I can throw Kong out. I don't have to worry about target odor. So it does have advantages in actually using Kong, and it could be any neutral odor. Yeah, I use Kong because it's easy to get hold of. I actually get it direct from the research and development unit at Kong, so it's already cut up and ground up, etc. Saves me doing all of that. And if I go somewhere and lose whatever, a piece of Kong, they're pretty easy to find in PetSmart and Petco, and just cut it up and I've got my training aid again. So there are advantages to using the Kong. I can absolutely understand people worried, particularly explosive detection, narcotics, that my dog's going to respond on a Kong. Proofing and context, you know, and same as if my dog's a Kong dog and I've trained it on odor of Kong, again, context, you know, a lot of this is thinking about your training plan, developing a training plan, and then sticking to the training plan. You know, don't make it up as you go along. Have a systematic approach to your training with protocols which produce the dog that you want at the end. And that's all it is, a lot of planning and understanding the limitations and how to work around it. And I think people that sometimes have issues are those that actually, you know, rush into this and don't do it. And a slightly different approach that I also use is I do not train systems of search with odor. They're taught separately. So my systems of search are rewardable behaviors that do not use odor to change the system. They're positive reinforcement on their own. And then odor is added separately. So the dog might encounter an odor during a search, or it might not. The fact it encounters odor is a bonus and actually gets it to its primary reinforcement a lot faster. But if it doesn't encounter odor, okay, I can still reinforce it. I reduce the stress and frustration that the dog has not found odor after 20, 30, 40 minutes of searching. And I still have the option to reinforce a really good get over or whatever it is I want to reinforce. So the dog's still being reinforced during that search. And I reduce all that stress and frustration, and that increases duration of search. So two slightly different approaches there. I have no issue using Kong, but if a particular dog or a particular task did not suit it, then I wouldn't use it.
And I think where I was coming from, Paul, is more like, if I knew the dog was going to be an explosive dog, why would I? Like, I could shorten the process down by not having to build with a Kong to start with and then move over later on and just go straight to an explosive odor.
Yeah, I think the only thing there is the advantage of having aged odors in the environment without having to worry about using explosives. And if you are looking for landmines or something like that, that's the approach that I would use to model that behavior. But absolutely, you know, if you're not going to use an explosive detection dog outside of a normal workday, or you have the ability to age odor within the environment, live explosive odor, then yeah, why use Kong? But if you don't, it just gives you another tool to allow that dog to understand what a buried aged odor is like, or an aged odor within a real environment.
That's a good point. Ryan, I know you've got something to say.
Well, I guess, I mean, I'm kind of ambivalent either way. I've learned a lot from Paul Bunker, as well as Tobias. I don't think there's really anything wrong with it, but I'm going to put on my program manager hat here for a minute. So I'm running an entire program. We purchase dogs generally that are, at least the vendor claims they're finished, and then we kind of polish it up at the end. So I know most of those dogs were initially trained on Kong. So just like you were saying, because most of the vendors here in the States, they get these dogs from Europe, they're bringing them in. They don't know whether they're going to sell them as a bomb dog or a bed bug dog or whatever, but they still want that search pattern, and they want to make sure that the dog is able to follow their nose and do what they need to do. So at least on the program that I run, we have the ability to use aged live explosives. So I don't have that issue, but really those proofing protocols. So I will make sure, especially when we first bring the dog in, but through its entire life of maintenance training, we are proofing it off of the Kong operationally. But I'm with Mr. Bunker and Tobias. I don't think it's a huge problem, but I get what you're saying. If you know it, like you're just an independent guy and you get this dog and it's going to be your bomb dog, your static bomb dog, not a mine dog. Do you want to spend the time adding that extra odor? I think Paul hit it on the head of, as long as you have the ability to have aged odors and do that kind of stuff, and it depends on what country you're in, I think I would skip it personally. But if you don't have that ability, Paul's 100% right. You can use that odor and bury it for weeks, days, years, and go out and find it again.
Oh. Anyone else in the panel have a thought at all that they want to share regarding that?
Wayne, was the question that I seen, the question was that, did it revolve around fully utilizing the Kong, the reward, as to complete the entire picture of a finished dog? Or was it for, because I use toys reward for gameplay, like Paul said, for search pattern. I use them for tech transfer drills. I just caution, something in me cautions about utilizing the reinforcer as a trained odor to the extent that I'm creating the entire foundation.
Let me just read the question in entirety for you, and then you can take from that. So the question was, what are the thoughts of the group in teaching a dog to search for its reinforcer as the foundational odor? For example, imprinting and teaching a dog in the first instance to search for Kong odor and create a solid foundation in searching and search-related behaviors first, before introducing other target odors later down the track. Will this create odor bias?
Yeah, I don't think it would create odor bias. I'd be cautious of the simple concept of detection is the basic association between target odor, stimulus, response, and reward. If you remove that, then does the reward odor override the trained target odor? The other perspective is being cognizant of legalities. They look at your training records and, oh, your dog was basically imprinted on reward odor. Maybe I'm a little off base, but that's my.
No, I think you're 100% on, Frank, which is one of the reasons why we do the proofing protocols once they're on board on our program. And those proofing protocols are in all of our records. So we can show for the last 6 years, this dog's never alerted on Kong, even if the vendor initially trained him on that before they knew if it was going to be a bomb dog or dope dog or whatever. Right. But those records will save you for sure.
So I've got a question for the sciencey type of background panel guys. So, with some deck cord, there's some fridges that have a coating on the back around the pipes that dogs that have been imprinted on deck cord will indicate on, because there's a similarity of something there. has this ever been found with the Kong? Is there anything manufactured or white good or anything that has a similar odor smell to the Kong rubber?
I think Paul Bunker would be
So not a sciencey guy, but I will tell you that a dog can distinguish between a black Kong, a red Kong, and a blue Kong. They are that good, and the odor is so variable that they have that ability to be very specific. So while I won't say that a rubber exists in the environment because I don't know, I'll say that the odor of a Kong is very specific in its manufacture process. They use something called a smoke, which is what changes the hardness. So a black has a lot of smoke and smells a lot stronger than a red Kong. And that strain smells stronger than a blue and a pink. And the dogs can be trained to distinguish between those because of the level of smoke in them or the changes in the rubber because of the manufacturing process. So yeah, could you encounter a target in the environment that the dog believes is similar? If you have a liberal dog, he's going to tell you it there. Conservative dog, he probably isn't. I can't say you won't, but I'm pretty confident it's not something that concerns me just because the dogs can be so specific in the way they're trained on Kong odor.
That's interesting. Thanks for that, Paul. That's something I did not know about the Kong sport. One more question, and then I'll let John take back over his little question sheet. So, extending the search time frame, what are your thoughts on how to conduct this? And when do you reward? Is it variable through searching, or if it's a blank, don't reward until the dog's removed from the area of search? So that's kind of like a two-question.
So you're talking about search, teaching the dog search length. Is that what you're speaking to?
Yeah, I think that's what they're trying to say. Like extending the search time frame to be instead of 15 minutes, 20 minutes, but a couple of hours or etc.
Yeah, I already said about this. I train search sequence separate from odor. That reduces frustration and the dog getting stressed because it's not detecting odor. It's also reinforceable because I've taught the dog directionals, and 99% of the time I work dogs off leash. But even dogs that are not trained on leash, I have behaviors within that I could give the dog a directional, for instance, and then provide a reinforcement. And that means the whole process of conducting a systematic search is as rewarding, or can be rewarding, as much as finding target odor, and that increases duration. And then it's down to fitness, hydration, nutrition, all the physical aspects that you have to put into a dog, acclimatization, to ensure that it can actually physically go through duration, rest breaks. But the actual process of maintaining duration and desire to search, I think, is greatly increased by not relying on odor to maintain motivation.
Always like when Paul Bunker jumps on and does anything. Always informing. Anyone else? I can see.
I think
Bill.
Paul hit it on the head, but what I would just add again from a program manager standpoint is your record keeping. So knowing which dog, what their duration is before they start giving up, and recording that. So then on your next training repetition, hey, this is Canine Scamp. He has an issue after 14 minutes based on previous stuff. So, okay, now you extend it a little bit more. And like Paul said, we will reward when we've extended that and the dog is pushing past previous boundaries that we know from our record keeping. We do reward some, and we use the variable reward too. Sometimes it's just the mark, sometimes it's the toy, but there is some kind of reward for pushing past whatever their previous boundaries were, or thresholds, however you want to say it, on that timing before they start not paying attention or not sniffing, or their accuracy goes down when you're in the training with the actual odor out. But to me, that record keeping is very important to know where your dog is at it's one thing for us to have in our heads of like, oh, well, it's been 5 minutes. Well, has it really been 5 minutes? We should be keeping track of that kind of stuff to increase the capabilities of our dogs.
Paul or Bill?
Well,
What they said.
I concur. You need to keep track of each individual dog and where they were, where they're trending, and do that reward before you hit that mental fatigue, and reinforce that and stretch it out as you go.
Yeah, I'm very deliberate in how I grow my sport dog customers. All the factors that have already been discussed. Just making sure I try to, when it comes to like distracting odors as well. Like I just don't make a big deal about it. Like by the time the handler gets done the search, they realize I've been searching for 7 minutes. And because I know how the dog is doing, and I'm very deliberate in how I run each dog and how I run each search as the instructor. And so if you just know your dogs, you know your teams, then you know how to grow them and push them. I tell them all the time, you don't want 100% dog every session. Like we want to see where the failure points are at so we know where to grow from. And so I'll very deliberately do it so that by the time they get to searches for trial, the longest search in the AKC side is a 15-minute search with 10 hides. Well, you Mrs. Jones and her dog Fluffy doing that because 95% of the participants are women. Like that's the longest search they've ever done. I get all of us working dog dudes, have searched for hours and hours and hours, taken a break, slept in the Humvee, they got out of the Humvee for the next search. I get that, but they're not used to that. And so it's a big deal. So I'm very deliberate and how I push them by the time they get the trial, they won't even realize that their dog's stamina is way higher than they expect it to be.
I'll throw this in with the so I agree with what everybody said with the basically the successive approximation. You're creating the endurance. You like that word, right, Bill? Makes me sound a little smarter than what gradually increasing that endurance with the dog. I think, and the first go-to that a lot of people have are the extended blank searches. One thing that the handlers need to be cognizant of is how the blank extended searches are introduced. The four-legged critters know the difference. They know the difference if we're running a known blank search, and there is a difference between a long extended search with the hide. So it's to our responsibility to create those long blank searches. The best thing we could do from a trainer's perspective is set out those time frames that Ryan and everybody mentioned. Set out those time frames, not letting the handlers know that it's a blank search.
What about, if I may, rewards at the end of blank searches? Or I know some people say no reward, you've done your blank search, that's it. Whereas there's also the idea of giving a reward saying, yep, you've done well because you've not indicated where you shouldn't have indicated, but maybe also then moving on to something exciting after a blank search, like playing a game of tug or something like that, to keep the dog's stress levels down and motivation elevated.
Let me throw this to Paul or Nathan, because I've learned from them the blank, Paul, help me out here. The no response reward, the blank reward, all clear.
Yeah, there's all clear, or the go, no go, but the all clear. Yeah, that's a Nathan question, I think, specifically. I use the all clear in training, but obviously Nathan's the expert on that.
Sorry, can't find the mute button. Yeah, so we played around with some of these things, and going back to what others have said, that there is definitely an important thing to systematically expose the dogs to true blanks within searches and real blank searches, because that's what happens operationally. And the dogs can, if they can discriminate between those two scenarios, in which one is a operational true blank versus a setup blank or a find hide, then the dogs will definitely do that. So we set up an experiment where we had two identical rooms. There's really no difference between the rooms. They were just right next door to each other. And you could just change the parameters of the frequency at which a target odor would appear in one room versus another. And you'd get the exact same dog with two completely different response rates and two different accuracy levels, simply by manipulating the frequency of that target odor that was appearing. But you could train them in your training scenario to have similar types of conditions between those two rooms. And if you train them that they're, to bring them down to a target find rate that's more similar to what they were getting in their, quote unquote, operational room, then performances would match perfectly. But if you have a setup where training is they find something every 2 minutes or every 1 minute, and then you bring them out to a 10-minute, 20-minute, hour, 2-hour search, then they can clock the fact that things have changed, and you can get a change in search. And on top of that, one of the interesting things that we found with that was it was very odor specific, meaning that the dogs never forgot what the odor was or that they were doing a task. So if they happened to come across the odor, meaning they got their nose close enough to the odor, they would always alert regardless of the condition. They didn't forget that if I smell this odor and I make a response, then I'll get rewarded. But what happened is that their search behavior declined. That, I call it a search behavior chain, as that first part declined and that they just weren't searching effectively. So for the explosives people, what that would mean is that there could be a big difference in whether your dog can find smokeless powder or TNT based off of duration of search and how well they're searching, because those different kinds of odors have very different vapor pressures, but dogs have different detection threshold limits for them. So that one odor, you need a very particular kind of search pattern. With another odor, that can kind of smack you in the face from across the room. And even if you're just kind of rolling around and walking around, that odor might hit you, and then the dog will pick it up and do that perfectly, do their final response. But if you have an odor that is a bit less like that, they need to be engaged in that detailed search. Those would be the situations where you might have a miss. And getting back to the question of, do we reward all clears? And I say it depends on the parameters and the dog. And the reason for that is because you can just think of it anthropomorphically like yourself, is that if you create a situation where I search 10 square feet, and if I indicate that it's all clear, I get a reward, and you're in an operational scenario where 99.9999999% of the 10 square feet that they search is all clear, then the dog could get 99.9999999% of rewards by making an all clear response. And they can clock that fact, that they can play those kinds of proportions, that it's more likely that I can just make this same response over and over and over again, regardless of putting the work into it, and still maintain a really high reward rate. I think my stuff just died. Can you still hear me? Okay. So then, and the point at which the dogs would clock that fact differed. So we had one dog, Buster, who was very sensitive to that, is that once the all clear rate was being reinforced at a high level, and there was a higher probability of an all clear occurring than a target occurring, he would just switch over to just doing an all clear response and walking straight past odor. Whereas other dogs would not. And it definitely differed. But then with Buster, you could just manipulate those parameters. You could reduce the reinforcement rate of an all clear response. So if his all clear response, you reinforce that at a 10% rate, but reinforce his finding of a target at 100% rate, you could start to balance those things and get really nice performance. So I don't give any general recommendations on it because it ends up being very parameter specific to your search parameters. So if it's something like you're going out there and you're going to find 30 targets in your search, then no, there's not a reason to need all clear responses because you have that right. You can reinforce all clear responses without a problem because you're going to have that really high target rate to bump that up. But when you have a situation where 99% you're doing is all clears, then creating that balance, it becomes very dog specific and task specific, and even I think odor specific as well.
I think a little caveat to that is the operational teams. The majority of explosive and narcotic detection dog handlers, the dog's given all clear. It's just that you have never trained it and you don't necessarily formally call it that. But when you search a line of vehicles, a line of packages, luggage, even multiple rooms, that dog completes a search and then drags you to the next suitcase, to the next vehicle, whatever it is. Or you let the dog loose to search a room, it goes round, it does its search, and it comes back to the door to try and get out to go to the next room. They're all clear. If you ask a handler, well, why are you leaving this suitcase? Why are you leaving this room? Well, the dog's told me there's nothing here. So, that is an informal all clear, but also then the dog being able to move and continue its search with an opportunity that it might find a target odor, which is reinforceable. The actual process of moving on and continuing the search is reinforcing that all clear behavior, which isn't formal. So, I do use all clear. Both my working detection dogs are taught the all clear. And I've had people say, well, that wouldn't work in explosive narcotics. It works because you do it. You just don't recognize it as a formal process and you don't make it a formal process. But the dogs tell you there's nothing here. You recognize that, you move it on, and you reinforce it through the search sequence.
I know we found practically what Nathan explained. We just didn't do it in such a scientific way, but we do that all clear reinforcement, but at a very limited level, and it's worked great for us over the years.
This is quite a long question, guys. So I'm going to read it best that I can. Try and put proper pronunciation into it. And if anyone misses something, just let me know. So the person's currently working detection dog and gets to train on live odor most shifts. So his questions relating to false responses and indications. They transport their odor target in clip seal bags, mostly unavoidable. And they use it in a training controlled environment. His dog works for 4 years, and just when I think he seems to be getting confident to work past these controls, we have false indications for a week or two before I can work him past them again. Given they are prevalent in the real world, I don't necessarily want him indicating on them. If that makes sense.
So the first thing I would ask is, what does the dog do in the real world? What does it do in environments away from a training environment in which it would encounter similar odors? Because that would tell me whether it's an issue with the target or the controls, whatever he's using, or whether it's an issue with the training environment and the training controls. And once I got the answer to that, then I can start to address the issue. But if we're saying this dog detects controls within a training environment and we haven't assessed that same dog in a different environment where it will encounter those types of targets, we're not really understanding what the problem is.
Just to add on to that, another part of the question further down is, I've tried various methods to correct him, wait him out, move on, mark on and move on, mark no and reward from search area, remove and give timeouts. I've recently introduced a no reward marker, NUP, and he'll happily search on, but it seems none of these have a real learning aspect for him.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of questions that need answered for this. And so I know that there was a question before about no markers. I don't use them, and I think it was discussed at length that people don't want to use them because you're giving communication to the dog, whether it's right or wrong, and what it should, or you're giving the answer to the dog. And if we're saying that in this case, the handler or trainer is providing a lot of answers to the dog, but it will happily move on and continue searching, then I don't think you're resolving the issue. What you're doing is allowing the dog to actually understand, well, I don't really have to do anything. You're going to tell me if I'm right or wrong until the point I am right. So I think, you know, for me, if this was presented to me with a team, then I would have to do a lot of deep diving into the issues that actually exist and what are the root causes before I could resolve any problems that exist, because I don't think we know the answer as to why this is happening. And that's what I would need to know first.
Could I just butt in a little bit here, just in relation to this question and what's actually happening as I'm reading it and listening to you guys and what you guys have said so far. But the fact that these handlers and trainers are using a clip seal bag, which is those plastic and paper bags, I'm sure Nathan will be able to confirm or deny this. There'll be an exchange of material. There'll be traces of plastic or whatever's been put onto the paper will get onto the actual target odor. And so now you've got a target odor that's got some hint of whatever's on the paper. And so when you're using it as a control in a search area, they're picking up that plastic that they have already been trained on, like some trainers do compound training where they'll train multiple odors together, and then they'll be able to indicate apparently on each of the separate components. So is that something that is happening in this particular scenario?
So I'll need the quick American translation to clip seal.
Oh, Ziploc.
Oh, okay, yeah. So Ziploc is, in terms of an odor storage tool, is not ideal. It's permeable, so it means that your odor is leaving your bag as well as you've got things coming into your bag. The plastic itself can be relatively volatile as a component, meaning that it depends on what it is that you're using as your material. But if you have something, you know, like a chlorate or ammonium nitrate or something like that as your target that really just does not give off a lot of odor, then, you know, if that's part of your material, then that can be part of, you know, that can be imparting the odor onto your material, so that in reality, you know, your material is not giving, it's about ratios of how much odor your different materials are giving off, and it's kind of an overshadowing effect where you can put a very low vapor pressure, very low odor material in something that can then actually give off more odor than what it is that you think that you're training to. So that definitely can be it. Mylar bags are nice for heat sealing or sealing off things and being a little bit better for storage. Glass containers are quite nice as well. But yeah, definitely the Ziploc bags are not an ideal storage tool.
And am I understanding the question correctly, that the dog is falsing on the Ziploc bags and then he can't get the dog to stop falsing on the Ziploc bags? Is that what I'm tracking?
Yeah, that's what I understand from sorry, that's what I'm understanding from the written question, because it's quite long. is that he's indicating on the controls, which are paper bag and clip seal bags or Ziploc bags, and he says that it's unavoidable using them as the storage, and they're false indicating on those, or they are correctly indicating, I guess, on the bags.
Exactly. I think Nathan and Paul Curtis hit this on the head before. I think absolutely the Ziploc bag is now part of the source material because it goes both ways. And then it's a separate question of how do I, in general, get my dog to stop falsing, which we already kind of talked about before. And I think Paul Curtis hit it of like some dogs, higher intelligence, they move on their own. Other dogs, you need to provide some reason for them to not want to give a false on that particular owner. But I think it goes back to what we were talked about before.
We'll just jump in quickly and clarify probably what a lot of you guys don't get over there is in Australia, all our drugs are stored in clip seal bags. You don't have a choice of it. It becomes basically just our policies here, and I'm pretty sure wherever that handler's from, they've probably got the same one there. So we all, in Queensland, all our drugs, regardless whether they're used for training or actually stored in a property point for destruction while they're in court, they're stored in clip seal bags, unfortunately. So what we do here is, from the time the dog's imprinted in it, the first control we introduce is a clip seal bag, because we're very aware that that is part of the scent picture, obviously the odor pictures of the dog. So we are actively, as soon as the first control is brought in, it's usually a clip seal bag for us to try, obviously, get the dog to understand that, yes, it's part of the odor, but it's not what we're looking for.
I think further to that, operationally, any dealing with drugs, all the offenders store their drugs in clip seal bags. It's the way that they store drugs here. So I would never use a correction or a reversive around a clip seal bag by itself, because the dog's not wrong. It's part of the scent picture. I just train it through. It's a constant maintenance. I address it through like the control wall, like the Herstick wall. Clip seal bags are there. If the dog indicates on it, I'll just wait it out. When they go on and find the whole piece of the puzzle, then I'll reinforce that. And we'll get it operationally. It's a classic that you go to the kitchen, the third drawer down, let people keep their sandwich bags or the Ziploc bags. The dog will show a heap of interest there. You probably won't hopefully get an indication, but it's not something I think you can fix, because the next time you reinforce on the primary target, say the cocaine, the clip seal bag, you brought that clip seal bag back into the picture. So I think it's just a constant maintenance, like trying to show the dog, like, hey, this is just a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole answer. You need to find the drugs. So kind of that makes sense. So I think it's just a constant training to address that.
It's kind of like having the cutting agent thing with the narcotic. So you're constantly working, like the cutting agent's always going to be there, but it's not the actual source you want the dog indicating on.
Yeah, so
that's an interesting problem that you guys have. It would be interesting. I mean, there hasn't been an experiment that's demonstrated this, but from behavioral principles, if you started off with, say, an initial odor, and you would include clip seal bags in that initial odor before you train your narcotics in the clip seal bags, or before you train with the narcotics, and that becomes a part of the stimulus picture. The clip seal bags as extinction stimuli, which should be quite easy at that point, right? Because the dog would be green, wouldn't have had that. From a blocking effect or theoretical blocking effect, if you do that with sufficient early training, before you actually get to the clip seal bag as being a part of the odor picture, you shouldn't get stimulus control on that. No idea if it would work or not, but the paradigms that have been used in other sensory stimuli domains with other animals would have indicated that is what you would get, is because you would have that as prior sort of learning that that's not a non-target, so that when it becomes a part of a target picture, it was already learned to be an irrelevant stimulus. But no idea if it would work or not, but it would be interesting to test that.
Yeah,
Yep.
what I've started doing, I don't know if any of you have the same issue. I use gloves for my odor hygiene. And so I get them from Harbor Freight because they're the cheapest ones I can get. And so they're 5 mil gloves. That's what I use. And so what I've had to start doing is I didn't even think about it, but I started doing proofing. Again, I just introduced it into training, didn't make a big deal about it for the students. So the tape that I use to affix, my tins and stuff like that, the quake hold that I use to do that, I'm proofing the dog off of those that were neutral that have never been near odor. And I also have had to start proofing dogs off of the rubber gloves. Because what I found is a couple of dogs that when they smelled the gloves in a tin that had never been near odor, that were completely clean and everything else, good hygiene, the dogs were offering indications on the tin that had a piece of the glove in it. And then in turn, like it was just the weirdest thing to start to see that they were doing that. Again, you try and be as good with your odor hygiene as possible, but you don't think about the fact that, hey, I'm running around touching everything with gloves, and now my dogs are going to where gloves are at because it's a part of the picture, kind of like Stuart Eckert was talking about with the bags. The bags are a part of the picture, and eventually you don't recognize it. Now, in trial, the dogs aren't being exposed to that, but I wanted to be aware of it and just kind of proof off of it and see if it worked. And sure enough, I had 3 or 4 of my really good dogs that offered good solid indications on the spot where it was just a tin with a glove that had never been near odor before. So it was just an interesting data point to kind of see.
Understanding a bit more, thanks for that, Stuart. One of the considerations that has to be made is that when you're doing a training setup in discriminating between, is it clip seal, Ziplocs that contain target or don't, is that when you have your target out, and as Nathan said, if it's a really small odor target, you have to be 100% sure that the target odor is in sufficient quantity that the dog is going to be exposed to that to be rewarded. Because if it's not, then actually you're rewarding or reinforcing the clip seal odor, because that's primary within that scent picture. So you have to have that confidence that the odor exists, and it's not, I don't know, an aged cocaine that's actually had some sort of, is dried up, and it's now not viable as a training target for us to be able to reinforce that. And actually what we're doing is reinforcing the container, the clip seal, because that is the viable odor that the dog encounters first, or the stronger odor. So that is a very important consideration, particularly if this is going on where the dog is so convinced that an empty Ziploc is its target, then there's either an odor issue not available during training, it's been reinforced that way, or a discrimination issue.
Yeah, it's all very good points. And like I said, I'm not too sure where this handler's from. And we're lucky in Queensland, we've got the luxury of being able to go to our local stations and around the southeast corner of Queensland, and we can actually go and sign out recent drug seizures that are currently being held and probably point and train on them. So we're getting a variety of drugs at different quantities that have different, obviously, thresholds and vapor thresholds and all that kind of stuff, and obviously different sizes of bags. And then obviously also bring those controls in all the time. So we're pretty lucky. We know there's other agencies out there who can't do that. And they're stuck getting drugs off their, whoever tests their drugs, and once it's been tested, they give it back to them. We do have the luxury to pretty much go anywhere in our local area and get drugs out, which is not very heard of around here. So we are sort of lucky, and that's how we sort of get around it, I guess. We're just keeping that variation, constantly ticking over for the dogs.
I'm going to mention just a few things regarding the proofing. With the proofing, hopefully the manner and protocols are as stringent and rigorous with the with your controls. So hand in hand with that, a lot of times I've heard people having difficulty with the controls when it actually wasn't the controls that the dog was alerting on, it was the disturbance. So it's something that everybody should take into consideration with, breaking the problem down and dissecting it and saying, what exactly is the dog alerting on, and then if it is disturbance, take your control, and I don't even hide the control. Put the control in an open area, on a seat, on a bench, and take the disturbance away, and you can break it down like that. I don't know if that helps anyone, but I'll throw that out there for anyone. So
that's a good point.
All gone quiet. I just something that Bill mentioned, proofing off. When you're putting items out using sticky tape and all these kind of things, and the possibility of the contamination of the dog then picking up and indicating on sticky tape and stuff like that. I was just wondering if maybe Nathan can answer this one. Probably is because we use a lot of magnets to hold stuff. Does magnet absorb odor? I know that like you get stainless steels and things like that have very little mixture with odors, but what about magnets that we use to attach stuff to cars so that the dogs can go and do a search? Oh,
Sorry, I didn't know if it's me or Paul. I'd say probably the magnet would depend on the coating material, and what you have there. Depending on that coating material, then it could be absorptive. In general, there's not a lot of studies out there. Lauren DeGrief's been sort of working in that area about how much different materials will absorb your odor source. In terms of like the best practices, sort of scientific principles, really there are 3 materials that are allowed in olfactory work, and that's going to be high grade stainless steel, so like 316 grade. I don't know if that's the same coating for you guys, but then also Teflon or glass are really the 3 main materials that are going to be non-reactive with what your material happens to be. I think depending on, in a lot of practical senses, probably not going to make too much of a difference. It does always bring up a curiosity, because there has been some work that suggests that dogs do have a magnetism sense, like pigeons do. So I don't know if they could actually detect magnets in of themselves. I don't know if anyone's ever tried that. The only studies that have shown potential sort of dog magnetism is that they align themselves when they poop in magnetic north and south directions. But anyway, sorry, I get off. So could the dogs potentially detect, contaminated magnets? Possibly. In practice, I'd say probably less likely, but it could be. And generally, when these things come up is when you're working with hard odors. I think there's a big difference that sometimes we don't respect between easy odors and difficult odors. When you have a difficult odor, then any little cue that is available, the dogs will learn, because that cue can be more salient or an easier marker of something than working with an easy odor that, is just a very easy cue for the dogs. Even though there might be other cues that the dogs could use, they're not going to use them because the odor becomes the more salient cue.
Yeah, that question about the detecting the magnetism was going to be my next one. So, I'll look more into that.
Well, Johnny, if I can just throw in there from a practical standpoint, one of the things that we do for proofing, I guess, is probably the best term, but because we use stash boxes all the time that have the magnets in it, I think they're pretty commonly used in our industry. But like you were also talking about the tape and different things that can absorb odor or give off their own odor. We have a set of stash boxes that never touch odor. They're always our blank. We don't store them with our other stuff, but they're the same brand and the same everything of the stash boxes. And we will put those out as blanks. And same with tape. If we are using tape to like tape up different aids, we've got the same brand and the same type of tape that is nowhere near our training aids, or it never touches that stuff. So it's not just we had a stash box and we boiled it off or did the best we could to get the odor away. They never touch it. And those are part of the proofing protocol. So even if they can detect magnets, are they giving a final response on it, or are they just going to it? To me, there's a big difference there. But if you're adding that into your protocols, you're proofing it right there, no matter if it absorbs it, gives off odor, or whatever. It's not part of your target at any time.
Yeah, I agree with that. I like to add to what Ryan says. I do the same thing, and actually over the last few years, I've started adding those materials that anything that's associated with the storage and handling of training aids. I take those unexposed items and I make sure they're out as distractors, especially in our foundation exercises when we're imprinting or doing something of that nature. But I think, and we have no issue with those materials, with the Ziploc bags and the latex gloves and the tapes and the stash boxes and all those things. We do the exact same thing. It really almost never becomes an issue. I think the bigger takeaway that I found more important in previous years was those training areas, especially when you have a facility in those training areas, they become stale in the respect that you don't have the human odor mixture with those materials. A lot of places will have vehicles set out to put training aids, and those vehicles become stale with human odor or with the absence of human odor. So I found it pretty interesting when we started contaminating, so to speak, these training areas. We're putting the handlers that have not handled training aid material, but putting those handlers in those areas, having them sit in the cars, having them handle the door handles of vehicles and hang out in the rooms where we're going to do training for 20, 30 minutes, eat their lunch, whatever. We got a lot of value in that created a little more challenge for the dogs in those operational training exercises. So it was important to add that human odor, because even when you go put your training aids out, you're adding human odor whether you wear gloves or not, because you're releasing odor all the time. So, but I do use gloves for good, handling techniques, so I'm not cross contaminating something else. But even though you glove up and do everything else, you're putting odor on your training aids. But the clip seal bags or the Ziploc bags, we do that from day one in imprinting in the foundation exercises. All those items are placed out in other boxes or other areas, and we make sure the dogs sample those materials to put zero value in those items.
I recently had the pleasure of finding a duffel bag at a training complex, Ryan, no laughing, of about 5 different blocks of TNT that was aged between 6 months old and 25 years old, all just thrown into a duffel bag with old landmines, and that was their training bag that they would take with them to do training. Yeah, the old pucker started moving when I first opened the bag, but then when I realised what it was, yes, that was an experience.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. And you heard him correctly. 25-year-old TNT mixed in with 6-month-old TNT with devices, obviously inert devices, but they've got all the metal in there. And yeah, that was unique.
Cambodia's fun.
Well, now the bus just came and hit Cambodia. I wasn't going to say it, but yes.
Oh, no, that's all right. That's why we're around, try to help them out.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so now we've got a question. I think this is more around conservation, guys. So, John, do you want to read it out or me?
Oh, I've got it here if you want.
Okay, fire away.
Okay, so as Wayne said, it's conservation in relation to the storage and use of scat. It reads, I'm assisting conservation canine teams who are imprinting on scat. I'm wondering, number one, best storage practice, as in freezer temperature jars, vacuum seal bags. Then how long should I let the scat thaw before using it to imprint? And then do you find that long-term storage in the freezer impacts the odor profile of the scat, even those samples that have not been thawed or used? So that's a bit of a big one.
I'll start on this one. I do use scat, significant amount of scat in a number of projects. So it's going to depend on the scat itself, how I store it, but it's always in glass jars. I don't use Ziplocs at all for storing scat, and in the fridge predominantly, but if it's long-term storage, it's going to go in the freezer. One of the issues with scat is mold, and very quickly it'll start to form mold on the surface, and you can see it easily enough. And obviously that produces issues with the quality of imprinting. Age of scat. So we recently completed a project where it was mailed to us from various zoos and foundations around America. It was a fairly short-term project. So the scat would come in, we would very quickly use it, but there was so much of the stuff, like in one case, 5 pounds, huge, great container of scat, which we wouldn't need to use. So you're going to store that effectively in the freezer or something, on the understanding that it may alter the odor of the scat slightly, but not as much as mold would. And some of this scat was really molding up fast. So some of the drier scat, Sitatunga, we were using, which was a very dry scat, mold wasn't the issue. So I just keep it outside the fridge, actually, a lot more environmentally naturally aging, and just use it. As I said, the project was shorter term. So gonna have to look at the individual scat, gonna have to look at the water content, gonna have to look at the issue that mold might appear fairly quickly on the scat and cause issues. If I can store it outside the fridge, I will, but it's always in glass. If I have to, it will be in the fridge. And if it's long term, or I do have worries about mold, then it's going to be in the freezer. Once it comes out the freezer, then it's going to be thawed up to room temperature. So that would be my answer to how long do you thaw it for? Well, how much water content is it? How quickly is the ambient temperature going to allow it to thaw to actual room temperature or working environment temperature? I'm in South Texas, so, you know, if I take it outside, it's going to thaw very quickly, but that temperature will be up in 102, 110 in the environment that it's going to sit there. So I'm going to have to make sure it's thawed to a point where the odor is representative within the environment that the dog's going to encounter. I think I answered everything.
Paul, if you don't mind me asking, the mold specific to the scat, is the mold increasing because it is going in and out of the fridge and the condensation and the water content? Is it molding faster than it would in a natural environment just out after it pooped?
I don't believe it's actually doing it faster, other than the environment that the actual mold is living in is potentially allowing it to grow faster. Clearly, the scat came with the spores on it, because when we receive it, it's sealed. Once we allow it to start to sit in the environment, or we're going to start using it, or even sitting in the fridge, we see the mold very quickly start to take over. So my assumption is that certain molds, like either the cold of the fridge or the natural environment, and they're just growing very fast, you know, and there might be other spores that actually exist within the scat, but it just cannot exist within the environment that you're storing the scat. But very quickly, some of those scats were covered in white spores extremely quickly, that, you know, they weren't viable. And I'm talking 24 hours. We just had to throw it out. It's no use.
Well, we've lost Ryan Tate. He had to jump off because he's currently overseas doing some penguin training. But his background is conservation and working with the Australian National Zoos and etc. So he's actually given his written response to this same question, which I'll just read out on his behalf. But he says, depends on the species, but we typically find the following preserves the odor best for initial imprinting: collected by tongs, placed in a clean paper bag, then into a Ziploc bag, then into a sealed container, then into the freezer. This has been effective for fox, toad, koala, quail, New Zealand, don't know what that is, devil, feral cat, and native rats. Typically thaw over an hour depending on conditions and then throw it away or leave it in the same spot for a few reps throughout the day, but we don't refreeze samples. Anecdotally, they seem to break down and change odor between 3 to 12 months. Having said that, nothing beats fresh and untampered. So that's Ryan's response to that question. So what you might do is throw it open to anyone that's here. There is an option to put your hand up or just unmute yourself if you have any questions that haven't been touched on and you want to ask the panel. Fire away.
I'll just throw one out there that was in the chat earlier. I think someone was asking about Gentex tubes, if anybody uses them or how they use them. I lost it. Oh, Remy. Consider Gentex tubes. Sorry, I can't say it right.
Yeah.
The Gentex tubes, is that what the question was regarding?
It just came up in the chat earlier. Someone had mentioned that. So I don't personally use them, but I know lots of people do. And I'd love to get Paul's thought on that and Nathan's I'd like to get everyone's thought on that, I guess.
I've used them quite a few times. They're not my go-to, but it depends on the target odor. So I will use them now for human remains and oil, because those targets are so volatile and so persistent that I know that if I place a get sent out within a training environment, that my target odor is viable. Now, having said that, the get sent tube has neutral odor. So we did do some trials with one of my dogs. So initially she was responding on aged get sent tubes, but what we found, or what is believed by the developer, was that she was a hydrocarbon detection dog, and that as get sent tubes age, they give off hydrocarbons. So the reason that she could detect get sent was because she was trained to detect the molecules of the get sent as it ages. So initially it looked like dogs could detect get sent, but on further investigation we found they couldn't unless they're hydrocarbon detection dogs, or certainly that's how it appears. My concern would be that if I load a get sent tube, and it has to be loaded over time and ensure that there's a full load of odor within the get sent, is that once I place it out, that odor burns off. There is no target, there is no source there to continually refresh the odor. It's a one-way exchange off the get sent into the environment. And at what point is it that target is no longer viable on a get sent, and what other odors have been absorbed into the get sent? So if I use a metal container to load a get sent with target in it, it is also going to absorb the metal container or whatever is within that immediate environment of your primary target. The reason is that a get sent doesn't know what the target is. It doesn't know what it should absorb. It's just absorbing the environment. And then what odor is left that the dogs are finding. So they have a use like everything else, whether you use duckle gauze or Whatman paper, anything like that has an absolute use. Of course they do. Terry toweling. But you have to understand that with any of training aids, there's a limitation. But as long as you can mitigate that, and as long as you put those protocols into your training plan, then absolutely use them. But understand they are not the magic bullet to dog training. They are another tool that has limitations that you must understand. Otherwise, you're communicating the incorrect message to the dog.
So Paul, that's a really good point about the get sent tubes, because there's also, issues around other containers of odor. So what we can take away from this is to include variability within the training of the containers that's holding the odor, so that it's really does become more odor specific, and we can proof out the different types of containers that we use.
Yeah, and one of the issues that I did run into in landmine detection was that we were placing 0.0025 of a gram of TNT onto paper discs that go in Petra dishes in chemist laboratories or whatever. And we were placing those, we imprinted the dogs with those. That's how the target was supplied to us by DSTL in the UK. And then we were placing those outside, but the dogs would walk actual TNT. And what we found was that the dogs were using the odor of the paper as its primary source of detection. It was then, because we placed out blanks, the dog was then discriminating, did my primary source contain TNT? If it did, I'll give a response. So what we taught is paper detection dogs with a discrimination phase of TNT. So that is also something to consider if you're using the same type of containers. Is your dog looking for the container and then discriminating that that container contains target? In which case, you can put out as many controls as you like. The dog is still using that, and then a discrimination exercise to tell you whether the target is existing. So one of the easiest way around that is to put out target with no container and confirm that your dog will respond on actual source.
Excellent.
In Australia, unless you're, there is a few police officers here from Australia, but unless you're a police officer, you can't train with real narcotics, nor can you train with real explosives. And it all comes down to legislation and etc. Because the moment I take control of a narcotic to train with, I'm now in possession of a controlled substance, and so there's a lot of laws go around it. So it's not possible for us dog trainers to be able to train on real. It's just so we're able to get around that by using the Gentex tubes and the precision explosives odor discs that are preloaded and etc. And that's what allows us to be able to train the dogs, get them ready for clients' orders. So for us, right up to the point of when the dog's getting onto a transport, the only proofing we've really done is the explosive discs that come from precision explosives, which we know is real odor infused, but that's as close as we're going to get to real.
I'm gonna throw a little change on the pseudo versus the real fast if you got a second. Here we go.
Do we want to go down this rabbit hole?
What's that?
Do we really want to go down this rabbit hole?
Let's go for it. I'll give somebody. Nah, I won't even bring a name up. So I understand that there's a purpose behind pseudo, a need for it, especially leaving the government and going to the private sector. I understand how difficult it is for the private sector to get narcotics, suitable training aids. My issue that I'm promoting is when going, whether you are imprinted on real, going to pseudo, or vice versa. The problem is, what I'm hearing from a lot of trainers is that my dog was imprinted on real and he will not find pseudo. My dog was imprinted on pseudo, he will not find real, vice versa, right? So my take on this is, it's just like when working a dog on the street and I go to someone else's training aids, then going from military grade to commercial grade, and they've never seen that before. What I'd like to emphasize is set your dogs up for success, because and I know there's going to be a lot of people that disagree. Yes, there is a time for testing, but we have to, what I would like to emphasize is we are not a testing facility. We're not a university. I'm talking about the operational practitioners. They put their dogs up against a pseudo, and to a dog, in my opinion, that's another novel odor. So why not set your dogs up for success if he was imprinted on real and you're going to pseudo for whatever reason, and you put that training aid out as a pseudo training aid, you reinforce that with either a pay on sniff, or you reinforce that with a verbal assist, and you basically clarify to the pitcher to the animal that this is no longer a novel odor. This is now you're in your repertoire of trained odors. So many people are just going and you're letting your dog sit on a novel odor. Well, that can eventually come and bite you in the. In my opinion, it could create some issues that could be prevented. And there's my change for pseudo versus real.
I'll just comment on that, seeing that you've opened up the rabbit hole. So I've trained a dog on pseudo. No, we won't call it pseudo because that could get me in trouble. On an odor training package, right? And that odor training package, the dog I trained on that found real every time. Perfect indication. I trained a dog on real and then put out the odor training package, and the dog blew it off every time. So going one way seemed to work, but going the other seemed not to work. Now, I don't know the smarts behind that. Nathan or Paul Bunker or someone like that who's got way more knowledge than me might be able to break that down a lot more if they're game enough to in an open forum. Many people are. So, but that's what I think. And that was more than one dog. That was most probably 2 or 3 dogs, same thing, going the same way. But I found with precision explosive, and that's a pun because I resell them, I don't have that issue. I can imprint on that, and then every dog I give off to an agency, they put it straight on the reel, and it's indicated on the reel first go every time, and same going back the other way. You know what I mean? But having said that, the training package, the non-pseudo, the plume of odor is so big that that initial imprinting seemed to work really well for the dogs, because you had that large odor. The dog could sniff it right in and go, right, that's what I'm looking for. That's what I get paid for. You know what I mean? So, and look, I'm just a practitioner who's most probably only done like 11 to 12 dogs in my whole lifetime. But that's what I think during it. And that's all I'm willing to go into. Because I don't want to get sued by anybody. I know you've got to take on it, Ryan, and you gave enough.
Well, number one, I defer to the science folks here. I can just tell you my experience with it and where I've found success. And I'm going to be that guy that straddles the line again. I use both. I think they both have a role, and if used properly, can really enhance your dog's capabilities. So for me, I only imprint on scent logic, right or wrong. I've had great success for it. They always hit the reel for me, but that's just imprinting. Now, when I move on to operational dogs, I 100% add in precision explosives, any kind of live, one guy's cache of live is going to smell different than another. The age is going to be different. So to me, the more you can expose an operational dog to quality, again, I hate using the word pseudo, but to that pseudo odor, whatever you want to call it, as long as there's quality ones, and then to what those explosives are, those live explosives of different, from different sources and different ages and all that stuff. To me, the more you can expose that dog to, the better. But I've had great success, at least on the imprint phase, with the Scent Logic side and never had issues with them either falsing or at least falsing on odorish stuff, I should say, because my handlers will still cue them into falses. But finding the real or live versions of it, no matter what their ages are. But again, I'm using that all throughout their maintenance training. They're getting 25-year-old stuff. They're getting fresh stuff from different components. And I've had great success with the precision explosive stuff as well in operation or maintenance training wise.
Right, let's quickly get off this subject.
Fair enough.
No one has any more questions, and there's nobody in the waiting area that wants to ask any questions. We might call it a day and thank all of our panel. Paul Curtis, go and check out his detection boxes. They are absolutely awesome. Paul Bunker,
Thank you.
make sure you get his book. I love it. I've read it most probably twice a year since it's been printed, so it always comes in really handy to me. Frank has helped my wife out many times with her detection dog and working the dog in the airlock, so Frank's always there for a point of view. Ryan, who I work with overseas a lot, always good for a giggle, always good for information. And we've lost a couple that have already logged off, but we want to just thank all of the panel for coming today. Appreciate all of your inputs. And if no one has any questions, I'll wait a couple of seconds to see if there is. And if there's not, we will call it a day.
It was an honor to be here, Wayne, and an honor to be on this panel with so many, icons in the industry. So thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, I just wish I had
absolutely.
of all Nathan's papers that I could send to everyone, because there's some phenomenal papers by Nathan Hall and Paul Bunker together as well. So, but if you can find them, read them. They're awesome. Some of those are real eye openers.
Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate the invite, and I'm honored to be here.
Bye.
Thanks, Nathan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for having
me. Hey, thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Good day.
Good one, Frank.